Hello, hello, hello. So, this is going to be my tutorial for the beginnings of Substance Designer. And I'm just going to go over all the things I've learned and that I know that might help a beginner kind of get into the mentality of a texture artist. This is going to be very good for people who don't know anything about this program at all. Nothing. Nada. And I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. I'm going to try to make this pretty simple. I'm going to try to not over-explain anything. And I hope I keep my voice at a good volume, because this is only my third or second time recording like a tutorial trailer, or not trailer, tutorial kind of thing. So yeah, I made this very quick Photoshop presentation thing to begin with. So here, 1 second, please.
2 hours later.
Okay, so there's pretty much two fundamentals you want to get to know when you're trying to create textures. It's two fundamentals that actually go into any type of art form, some less than others, but for this specific one, we're gonna focus on the 0 to 1 scale, which is pretty much what everything in Substance Designer goes through when you're trying to create forms, shapes, and just trying to control height. So height basically is how you measure a 0 to 1 scale. And when we're talking about the 0 to 1 scale, basically what the most important things you would want to know is 0 is completely black, which means it's flat. It's negative space. It's nothing pretty much. You don't have an object. There's no like, you won't see rocks. If it's completely black, all you will see is this. This is pretty much all you see. Nothing. And let me get a uniform color here real quick so that we could see it a little bit better. Yep. Wait. Yep. This is all you see. Just a flat surface. That's all. And 1 second. Let's set this up so that I don't have to set it up later. Okay. So yeah, just a flat surface, right? Now, 0.5 is actually a halfway point in Substance Designer. So you actually start at, 1 second, please. Sorry, I keep pausing here real quick. It's my roommates keep coming in and out, making a lot of noise. So I'm trying to have a crisp, nice tutorial for you guys. So basically, what you start off with is black, right? But here, let me put this in real quick so I could explain it. Let me put on tessellation. Tessellation is the only way you could see like the height discrepancy on Substance Designer. So basically, if you just go to materials, default, physically metallic roughness default, and tessellation, it'll pop up this graph on the right side here. And if you go to scale, just put that all the way up with tessellation, and you'll pretty much be able to see your height. And I always work like this because I'm able to control my height very easily, and you could basically just picture it without actually having to picture it when it's flat, because right here you can't really tell what your height looks like. So I have this, right? And if we go to 0.5 here, you're going to see that it's not completely at the bottom compared to if I have, let's say, let's have all 3 levels here so we could see all of them. This might be really good for presentation purposes. Right, so we have our white layer, right? Our outer white, our gray, which is halfway between white and black, And you can see how this starts to affect this material here, because like we're creating something just based off of knowing that white is the highest point, and then black is the lowest point, and gray is everything in between. So for example, in this material, you could see that we have a lot of gray because it starts to get into that point where when you're adding a lot of detail, you control the values get crunched more, and they start to balance themselves out to the point where a lot of it is going to be well gray. And so like if I put this here, you see that a lot of it is gray. Like all this middle ground area is gray. And how I start seeing this is I start seeing it as almost like a composition or an environment art piece. And if you have ever drawn, you know that when you're putting down like the white colors, they're the highlights. You want like bright light colors to get the highlights, and you want the more darker colors for the shadowing areas. Well, that's kind of how I see materials. You want your darks to be like the lowest part of your material height, and you want the highlights to be the highest points. So it basically picks up with white and you lower it with black. And just like this graph right here, you could see, you know, I have the highest form being white, but let's say I made this 0.9, then it would be around here. And the lower I go with the value of 1 to 0, the lower you get to black. So basically all textures and all the forms of all the nodes in Substance Designer, all these nodes, they're all going to be run off of this 1 to 0 scale. And you know, sometimes they go up, you could go like to 16 and stuff, but it will always be on a 0 to 1 scale. This whole graph right here, even though it goes to 16, it's on a 0 to 1 scale. It's going off the same logic system, this 0 to 0.5 to 1. Once you start understanding the 0 to 1 scale, you'll start like seeing materials in a very different way, because you'll start understanding that let's say I have 1, right? I have this 1 right here. And let's say I'm trying to make a cool shape, and I'm like, how do I make like a indented swirl in here? Well, obviously I would have to take a white shape, right? And this is where it gets more complicated because you have to know more of the nodes, but the logic still stands. I have to, so there's subtract here, right? And subtract does exactly what it sounds like it does. It subtracts the value of 1 to the value of 1. So right now I'm subtracting this white value on this white value, and I'm getting a black value because I'm subtracting 1 on 1. Now, if I make this a 0.5 right here, right? And the blending mode is subtract. I get a less intense carving here because, you know, it's in the gray area right now. See, it matches with this playing field, and it's not going all the way down to black. And that's how you could control how much you want to carve into something, or like how much you want to control your height. And hold up 1 second here. Let me make this smaller. So yeah, so basically it's at 0.2 right now, and that's really low on this graph. It's around right here, 0.2, right? But because we're using the 0.2 but carving it into here, we're basically taking this 0.2, like that's in between right here somewhere, between this gray and black, and we're carving it out of the white. So that's at least what subtract does, right? Right now I'm explaining subtract while also trying to explain the 0 to 1 scale, because you could see right here there's 0 and then there's 1. And so you want to balance in between those two. And again, as long as you know this scale of 0 to 1, you could definitely get an understanding of how most things in Substance Designer work on a fundamental level. You won't necessarily, like, knowing the 0 to 1 scale won't magically teach you how to use the edge detect node or the shadows node or any node for that matter, but it'll give you a kind of principal understanding of how height works in Substance Designer. And height is one of the biggest things that makes a texture pop. Like if we go, let me give you an example from my portfolio. If we go to the Victorian ceiling that I made, this protrusion here and how I'm like subtracting these squares to create the ceiling effect is all based off of height. It's all based off the 0 to 1 scale. Say it with me, 0 to 1. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to say that with me. I'm being silly. Yeah. So we have, this is probably 1. This rimming here of like the wood structure is probably at a 1, like a solid 1. And we could probably see that in my height here. Oh, well, probably not. I didn't really record the height, but I'm sure that this is 1, and then this is closer to 0. It might be at like a 0.2, maybe a 0.1. It might not be black. I guess this one might actually be in the 0 space, and I'm just adding a couple of grays onto it to create these shapes. But yeah, when I start to really simplify a material to its core, it's just zeros and ones. It's almost like math. That's why Substance Designer I don't think is for everyone. It's just for people who kind of are more in like a technical / creative, artistic like balance, harmony. Substance Designer might not be for you if you don't think this way, if you don't think in a very structural, like node based. It's a node based program for a reason. It's more about like a foundation of math and like kind of like that type of mindset. So pretty much if you didn't like math in school, you might not like Substance Designer, but you should still try it out because you might be able to create badass art anyway. Like math is totally different from this, and I'm not gonna sit here and say that this is exactly like math because it's way more fun. Like you could literally just throw nodes together and get a cool like design like this one that I have here. It's not very, it's technical, but it's not like extremely difficult, is what I'm trying to say. So, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, okay. So, a refresher, basically, because it's been 10 minutes and I've just been going over this over and over again. 0 to 1 scale. 0 is black. 1 is white. 1 is the highest point. 0 is the blackest or lowest point. Black, white. You got the highest, you got the lowest. And then everything from that is a range, a gradient, everything. There's literally a gradient node here, and you could see it. You could see the value range. And if I quantize this, which is another node I'll go over later, you could see like the shades, all the shades, every shade of black to white. You could see it all. And let's go back here. Okay, so that's the first fundamental to learning anything Substance Designer is the 0 to 1 scale. And I'm not sure, we could see it in different forms here. We have this gray looking rock and it's protruding outwards, right? You could see how as you go deeper into the distortions of these black and white shapes, you could see how you can manipulate the grays and the whites and the blacks to kind of form a certain shape that you really, really want by cutting out, by extruding things, by adding onto your previous values, etc. I would almost treat it like a Photoshop layer, right? If you have, let's say if I draw this black cube and then I draw, where's my white? And then I draw like white, and then I draw some like white arms, and then I make like this in the middle for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe make this a gray. Then put some legs on this dude. You can see how the black kind of goes into the background, and it's almost like a shadowing, you know? You see it as almost like a shadow, because that's what how you see most values in real life. You see your shadows that are, you know, black, gray, etc. And then you see the lights as white. Like the sun is literally just a white ball that we see as color because of our retinas. So sorry for that awful drawing, but he kind of looks kind of creepy. But yeah. So, okay. I am going to move on now to the second fundamental. Okay, so the second fundamental of texturing on Substance Designer, it's a big one, all right? It's one that just goes back to the fundamentals of art in general, just in general. Big, medium, and small shapes. So, when I say big, medium, and small shapes, I pretty much mean just that. Big, medium, and small shapes. We have this square texture here, right? And within this texture, we have our big. Let me just even add. Let's, because this is gonna be super easy to explain once I do this. So we have our big, right? The squares are big shape, right? Our basic big shape. But then we have our more medium shapes, which are this one and this one. Our indentations into the square are our more medium shape. Then we have our smaller shapes. And without one of these, for example, the texture just becomes a little bit more plain. So as you're making a texture, you're micromanaging these shapes. You're micromanaging what big shapes you want versus what small shapes versus what medium shapes you want. When you're creating, let's say, a stylized texture, you're going to have more medium and big shapes and not a lot of small micro shapes. Small and micro shapes, because those are two different things, and I'll explain that later. We want to have more big and medium shapes. And now this is where it gets a little bit more complicated and nuanced, because not only are you micromanaging big, medium, and small shapes in a singular texture, but you're also trying to micromanage where they are going. So let's say I make the texture like this now. Now I have more big, medium, and small shapes. Now this cross is here, and it's a big shape. If I take away the small squares, this giant cross here turns into the big shape, and the perimeter outline of this square is a big shape as well. And now there's like smaller medium shapes. So you see like these 4 squares have become smaller medium shapes. And now I would say that this is a small shape. It's not even a medium shape anymore. It's more of a small shape. And these like small shapes have become a little bit more micro shapes. And as I zoom out of this texture and make it like bigger, you start to see that different big shapes get created, different medium shapes get created, and different small shapes get created. These squares that are just now filling the page, or filling this canvas or this texture, whatever you want to call it, are now becoming less small shapes and more micro shapes. And you know, stuff starts to become micro shapes when it's just creating a lot of noise. Noise is a fundamental all in its own, and it could be explained for hours just by itself, because it's just something that has to do with art and philosophy. But let's say I take this moisture noise. It's literally called moisture noise. It's a node in Substance. And let's say I blend it into the shape that we had already. So I put it on an overlay. Overlay does not work when you have multiply. There we go. All right, put it up. Now this thing has micro noise. All this noise that it has, it just adds on to the texture, and it makes it more, the more micro noise you have, the more realistic and natural a texture starts to look. Not to say that you should just throw micro noise on things just to make it look more realistic. Obviously not. You want to control your micro shapes. You want to actually like have control over all your shapes in general at all times. You should never just throw shapes together just because. When you're making a texture, you want it to have purpose and meaning. So you want all your shapes to have some type of reasoning behind them, not just, obviously this isn't a real material. It's more of like I'm explaining things through this material. But if this was a material, I would I would actually have a purpose to this. Like maybe this could be like a wood structure or something, or like this whole thing is like a brick texture that would go on a wall or something, something like that, right? So let me go back to the shape. So in this section of my rock material, there are these really small medium shaped rocks. And then here in this circle, there's smaller rocks, like really, really small rocks, even micro rocks to a certain extent. And then these large rocks scattered around the material are the big rocks. So with a material like this, it's very easy to see where each corresponding shape is in relation to itself. And it's all, at the end of the day, it's all about relations. Because when you're making a material, it's comparing itself to itself constantly. So in this texture, the big, medium, and small shapes are going to be totally different than in this texture. This texture might have more small shapes than this one. This one might have more medium shapes just scattered around rather than small shapes. And that's okay. That just all depends on what texture you're making. And I actually have a couple examples as to which is which. And I'm just gonna go through each of these three and analyze them really quickly to find the big, medium, and small shapes. And I'm sure you guys can find them too, obviously. I just want to reiterate on the fact of this fundamental principle that you should be thinking about when you're making textures on Substance Designer. So I made this sulfur pool recently, and this is actually one of the easier ones to kind of figure out what the big, medium, and small shapes are, because they're kind of just in your face. They like scream at you almost. So you have this large white border around this sulfur pool, and each individual pool is stacked on each other. These would be your big shapes right here. These ones that I'm circling right now, these giant pool outlines would be your big shape. So you could see how you could kind of maybe make that shape, and you kind of maybe make that shape through different morphings of the 0 to 1 scale. And basically, we want to understand this because every texture has this, and just basically planning before what your big, medium, and smalls are before you get even onto Substance Designer can actually help you massively just to understand how a texture is created in the first place. So we have our more medium shapes, which are these bands that cross around the pool. Sometimes they are inside the pool and kind of under the water or the sulfur. And they're kind of your medium shapes. They're basically these little squiggly lines that you could just plaster on your material. And so now we have two of our main shapes. We have our base giant shape, the pool shape, and then we have our little squiggly line shapes, which are our medium shapes. And then we get to the small shapes, and these are in this picture. It's specifically hard, but because I had other reference, I could see it better. But that's why you want to gather a lot of reference, obviously. But we have our really small shapes, and I'm going to zoom into this awful quality picture for a second. and you see these very, very small bumps, these ever so slightly small bumps on the actual rimming of the pool, the outline of the pool. You have these small, like, rock-esque shapes that are just on the pool, and those are your small shapes right there. You have all your shapes easily. You've planned them out. You have your big shape. You can think about how to make that on Substance. Maybe it's a circle. Maybe it's a circle, like, slightly warped. And there you go. You have it. And then you have your medium shapes. They're pretty much just squiggly lines. So you just got to take a bunch of little scratches, noises, and just try to form them into these little squiggly lines that run across the outline of the pool. And then once you have those two shapes done, you blend them together. And then once you blend those together, you get your small little, like, rock-esque noise, and you splatter it onto you overlay it, because there is a blend node that is overlay. You overlay it onto the outline foundation of the pool, of the separate pool shapes that you've already created. And just me explaining that, even though I'm, like, super out of breath, even me just explaining that, I could make this texture right now just because I understand the nodes, right? And I know it will be harder for beginners to just get this fundamental and be ready to go on Substance Designer. Obviously, you need to, like, get some practice with the nodes and all that, which I will go over. But just understanding how this is created, it's one step closer, and it'll be way easier to just create this material now, because you understand the properties of the shape design of the texture. And I'll go over these a little quicker, just because that one was kind of like an introduction to how just analyzing materials in general goes when you have reference. So this one, I'm just gonna really quickly point out the big shapes. Big shapes are these big chunks of striation. Where these lines cut, you kind of follow these lines, and those are your big shapes. So you have one here, right? And then you have one here. Maybe if I take this let me take this picture into, can I not? Take this picture into Photoshop, actually. There we go. Wow. Could have done this all along instead of being silly. Let's hide this. Okay. I should have done this with the sulfur pools, but I really feel like I explained that one pretty well. Here are our big shapes. Big shapes. You have this giant shapes, and you want to look at, when you're doing big shapes, you want to look at it as broadly as possible, because, when you're looking at it broadly, that's how you're able to actually see the big shapes. Obviously, it's hard to see big shapes because they're not going to be, like, pointed out for you, and there's actually some subjectivity in what the big shapes may be. Like, you may think that the big shapes I'm making right now aren't actually the big shapes, but yeah, so we have these big shapes, and they're pretty easy to spot once you had enough training to do so. There we go. We have those big shapes, right? This might have not been the color to do this with, but there we go. See, we have these massive shapes, and we got those, and then we look now for the medium shapes, and the medium shapes might be just these, like, cracks. And once we start pairing them with the big shapes, you're gonna start seeing, like, how the texture is actually formed, because you're understanding that there is like shapes within shapes within shapes, and that's the entire premise of this fundamental. Is just understanding that. And look, you see all these medium shapes, and it starts to, you start to break down a texture pretty easily when you start thinking about it like this, because this all happens. You don't actually have to go into Photoshop and do this. This all should be happening within your mind, so that you don't have to like expend like massive amounts of time thinking about these shapes. You should just think about them, figure out how to like process that in your mind, and then figure out how to make them on Substance Designer. And that's like the whole process of making a texture pretty much. My explanations actually might not work for everyone, and that's fine, because I have a way of thinking, and I'm sure that everyone else has like a super unique way of thinking that could actually like help me help them. But like, this is how I learned when I was starting off, and it's what has helped me stay in constant constant flow of making textures. And yeah, I hope that I'm able to help you guys out with your texture creation in the future or in the present. So yeah, now that we have these big shapes, we add on the medium shapes, and then you start seeing that this texture is just a compilation of just medium, big, small, and micro shapes. And it gets easier and easier as you do it, because you start to see shapes in a different way. You start to see like the little nuances in every texture and how they're formed almost. And so we have these medium shapes, but then what if I want small shapes? What if I want to see where the small shapes are? Well, we could start seeing them, and we could start seeing the little noises that there are in this very complicated texture. And it's crazy because there's so many that it's hard to get them all. This is the part where texturing becomes a little bit more creative and a little bit more artistic than realistic, is just trying to figure out how to procedurally create all these very small details. Like all of these like little cracks that you see, there are procedural ways to do these. This isn't just like you're just gonna be like, oh, that might be a medium shape, but this crack there. This isn't just like you're gonna be creating these like these specific areas of detail, because that's more in the concept art realm or in the environment art realm. This is more like you're trying to figure out ways to procedurally create these very small, subtle details. You see, now it's just a mismatch of shapes of medium, small, large. I hope that time it helped a little bit more, and it made a little bit more sense in case you didn't understand when I was explaining the sulfur pools on PureRef and the sand. There was actually a point to be made with the sand, and actually this might be part one of a 2-part series in terms of tutorials, because I think that I want to keep this short, and I also want to keep this just within the realms of the fundamentals. As you can see, I could explain fundamentals for Substance for a long time. It's already been 30 minutes of me just rambling on about this and hoping that I taught something to you guys. But I want to make a whole nother part for just the nodes, because just the nodes is another half hour, and I don't want this to be an hour-long tutorial again. Trying to keep them short, simple, and sweet, you know? So, basically, there is a point to be made with things like dirt, sand, rice, and some other materials that are just really like fine grains or just noise pretty much. It looks like just noise. But even within those types of materials like dirt, sand, etc., there are big, medium, and small shapes. You could definitely find them. You could, if you look hard enough for them, you can find them. And you could create materials that are a little bit more interesting than just me doing this. Let me give an example. Than just me doing this just to get dirt. You know, there's a lot more interest if you're able to find the big, medium, and small, because you don't want dirt that just looks like this. You know, you want dirt that has like certain patches of the dirt, certain like micro noise and medium noise and big noise. And so my point with that is to be able to spot the noise in relation to the material. So you have for sand, it's all micro noise. It's very fine grains, all compressed together. But a lot of sand has dunes. If you go to the beach, the sand will have footprints or dents, or just the wind has blown it in a specific pattern. And those are the big shapes. That's pretty much the big shapes. These giant crevices here, that's a big shape right there. Medium shape, big shape. These rocks, I'd probably say are medium shapes. And then we get the really micro noise shapes. And those are the things that are specific to maybe sand and dirt, and maybe rocks. Rocks sometimes have micro noise, and it's actually always good to put micro noise on rock, because it ups the believability a lot when you do stuff like that. But yeah, so the micro noise with sand, it has to be controlled. And that's why when I'm working with Substance, it's always good to start with the shape node. But that's all for this part of the tutorial, this part 1 of a 2-part series. I think that the next part is going to be just all the nodes, and I hope you look forward to that, because I'm looking forward to teaching you guys about all these different nodes. I mean, there's so many that do like crazy things that you wouldn't believe and are super useful in most scenarios. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this part of the 2-part series, and I hope you learned something, and see you guys.